Hey everyone, we are about to jump into a series on 1 Corinthians. Before we do, I thought it might be helpful to give a bit of an overview about the book. Maybe it's helpful to start with Corinth itself. It's an interesting place, even geographically. So Corinth was an isthmus, which is a narrow strip of land that connects two larger land masses and separates two bodies of water. And places like this, because of their location, were massively important for trade, and Corinth was no exception to this. It was a major east-west trade route between the Aegean and Ionian seas. Corinth also hosted the Isthmian Games, which were second only to the Olympics. And both of these things meant that people from all over the place were coming to Corinth, which also meant that it provided a good deal of wealth to the area. In 146 BC, though, the Romans came and totally destroyed the place. The place was a ghost town until 44 BC, when Julius Caesar came and rebuilt it and refounded it as a Roman colony. When Paul came to Corinth, it had been less than 100 years since it had been refounded and colonized by the Romans. So you had this interesting mix of both wealthy and not so wealthy people. And one of the really unique things about this place being reestablished was that you had people who came as Roman slaves when Julius Caesar rebuilt it, but who, during the process of relocation, could actually move up in terms of social class and wealth, what we would call upward mobility. And this was an important part of the culture in Corinth. And this is important to keep in mind when reading certain parts of the book, not least Romans 11, a chapter which is often misunderstood. So a scholar by the name of Richard Hayes says that when we read Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, we are literally reading someone else's mail. And this isn't the kind of mail you would want someone else to read, by the way. But this mail is a part of our scriptures. And the Apostle Paul is dealing with a bunch of issues in the small church. Sometime around 50 or 51 AD, Paul moved to Corinth to establish a church. And this was kind of Paul's thing. He went from place to place and started churches. Well, he lived there for a year and a half before moving on to Ephesus. And after Paul left, a guy by the name of Apollos came by for a while to do some teaching. And we learned from the book of Acts that Apollos could preach. He was like really, really good. And this was good for the church. Until it wasn't. Part of the culture in Corinth was to be incredibly competitive. Politics and personality were inseparable and often brutal. In the coming weeks, we'll learn about the different ways that this played out in the church. It's important to see, though, that the problem wasn't that the church was acting out of line with what would be considered normal. They were actually very much in line with what was normal in their society, but they were out of line with the kingdom of God. In some of the chapters you read about major sexual issues and sin in the church, and the problem was actually the same. There was this playwright by the name of Aristophanes who coined a verb that in English would be something like to Corinthianize, and he was talking about fornication, sexual sin. So totally in line with the Corinthian culture, totally out of sync with the kingdom of Jesus. So a lot of the problems in this young church had to do with the fact that their imaginations were still being captured by the surrounding culture. So Paul ended up getting communication from Chloe's people, we don't know who they are, to tell him about problems in the church. And Paul ended up writing them a series of letters, some of which were lost in history, and then a much longer letter, which is 1 Corinthians. And his intent on writing this letter from Ephesus was to clear up some of their problems, and there were lots of problems, ethical problems, theological problems, you name it, they had it. But even though Paul had moved on, he was their pastor. He loved them. And so he wrote to them to try to get them in sync with the ways of Jesus. Richard Hayes writes this about Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Paul calls on them to change in fundamental ways and to shape a different kind of community, rethinking their inherited socio-cultural norms and practices, as well as their ingrained conceptions of value, honor, and leadership. Social historians refer to this process of change as re-socialization. Paul elsewhere refers to it as transformation through the renewing of the community's mind, like in Romans 12:2. Paul wanted, in other words, to see their imaginations baptized. My prayer is that during this series, our imaginations will be baptized too. So, That's our overview of 1 Corinthians. See you Sunday.